On March 13, 1964, a young woman was stabbed to death outside her apartment in Queens, New York. The New York Times printed a story 2 weeks later that became the most famous proof of human evil ever published in a newspaper. The headline said 38 people watched her die and did nothing. Every psychology textbook on earth still teaches this story. There is only one problem. Almost none of it is true. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese. Everyone called her Kitty. She was 28 years old. She was the bar manager at Ev's 11 Bar in Hollies, Queens. She finished her shift just after 3 in the morning and drove home to the parking lot of the Long Island Railroad station next to her apartment in Kew Gardens. As she walked toward her building, a man named Winston Moseley attacked her with a hunting knife. He stabbed her in the back. She screamed. According to the New York Times article published on March 27, 1964, 38 of her neighbors heard her screams. Lights came on. People watched from their windows. Nobody called the police. The attacker came back twice over the next 30 minutes. Each time, more witnesses watched. And nobody did anything. The article was written by a reporter named Martin Gansberg, fed to him by his editor A.M. Rosenthal, who would later become the most powerful man in American journalism. The story exploded. It was the front page of every newspaper in America by morning. It became a sermon topic in churches. President Lyndon Johnson cited it in a speech. The phrase Genovese syndrome was invented to describe what happens when humans see suffering and refuse to act. 2 psychologists at Columbia and NYU, John Darley and Bib Latané, designed an entire experimental program around it. They called it the Bystander Effect. They proved that the more witnesses present, the less likely any single person is to intervene. Their work became one of the foundational pillars of modern social psychology. The 911 emergency phone system was launched 4 years later, partly in response to the moral panic this story created. Kitty Genovese's death became the symbol of urban decay, the failure of community, the indifference of city life. For 60 years, every introductory psychology class in the world has told her story the same way. 38 people. No one called. Then in 2007, an American Psychologist Journal article by Rachel Manning, Mark Levine, and Alan Collins did something nobody had bothered to do in 4 to 3 years. They went back to the police records, the trial transcripts, the original NYPD interviews with the people who actually lived in that building. The article was titled, "The Kitty Genovese Murder and the Social Psychology of Helping." What they found was not a moral failure. It was a fabrication. There were not 38 witnesses. There may have been 5 or 6 people who saw any part of the attack from their windows, and most saw only seconds of confusion in the dark. Almost no one had a clear view. 2 neighbors did call the police, one during the first attack. The reason help did not arrive in time was not indifference. It was that the New York Police Department in 1964 had no centralized emergency number and routinely failed to dispatch on "unverified screams" in Queens. Kitty did not die alone. A neighbor named Sophia Ferrar ran down to her after the second attack and held her in her arms in the lobby of the apartment building. Kitty died in a friend's arms, not surrounded by indifferent witnesses. In 2004, the New York Times itself published an editorial called "Kitty 40 Years Later" that quietly admitted the original story had been, in their words, flawed. So why did the lie stick? Because it told a story people needed to hear. The early 1960s were a moment of intense national anxiety about urban America. White Americans were fleeing cities. Crime statistics were rising. The civil rights movement was reshaping power. The story of 38 cold-blooded New Yorkers watching a woman die fit the moral panic perfectly. It justified existing fears. It was a parable disguised as journalism. The editor, A.M. Rosenthal, later admitted in interviews that he knew the witness count was probably inflated. He published anyway. He believed the larger truth, that cities make people cruel, justified the fudging of the smaller truth. The psychologists who built careers on the bystander effect did not invent the science to fit the story. The science is real. Group size really does affect helping behavior. But the canonical example used to teach the concept was a myth. Generations of students learned a false story as proof of a real effect. And this is where the Kitty Genovese case stops being about one murder in 1964 and starts being about you. Almost everything you remember from your high school psychology class came to you through a similar filter. A reporter shaped the story. An editor sharpened it. A researcher built an experiment around it. A textbook compressed it. By the time it reached you, the story was less about what happened and more about what the culture wanted to be true. The Stanford prison experiment was largely staged. The marshmallow test fell apart when researchers controlled for household income. Phineas Gage did not become a violent monster after his accident, despite a century of textbooks saying he did. The famous studies are often famous because they were good stories first and good science second, so here is the move. The next time someone quotes a famous study to you, ask 3 questions. Who reported it first? What did the original data actually show? Has it been replicated in the last 20 years? If the answers are vague, treat the claim as a story, not a fact. Stories shape how you live your life. You owe it to yourself to know which ones are true. Kitty Genovese deserved better than to be remembered as a parable for human cruelty. She was a real person who was murdered, and he did not die alone. If this rewired anything for you, hit subscribe for more videos that question what we were taught. Comment below with one fact from school you now suspect was a myth. We read every comment. And we will see you on Thursday.